Something about this story doesn't quite make sense. In the autumn of 1932, official Soviet newspapers celebrated what they called a triumph of socialist agriculture. Headlines declared record grain harvests. Government reports spoke of abundance. Radio broadcasts praised the collective farms, the kolkhozy, as proof that the Soviet experiment was working, that the new order had conquered hunger, that the future had finally arrived. And yet, in the very same season, in the very same country, people were eating grass, they were boiling leather, they were burying their children in fields that, according to every official document, were overflowing with grain. Somewhere between the headline and the grave, a story was buried, and for decades, the Soviet state made certain it would stay that way. To understand what happened, we have to go back to the late 1920s, to a country in violent transformation. Joseph Stalin had consolidated his grip on the Soviet Union by 1929. He was methodical, patient, and possessed of a particular vision, the rapid industrialization of a vast, largely agricultural nation. The problem, as Stalin saw it, was that Soviet agriculture was still fragmented. Millions of individual peasant farmers, many of them in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the North Caucasus, worked their own small plots of land. This, in Stalin's view, was inefficient. It was also politically unreliable. The solution was collectivization. Beginning in earnest in 1930, the Soviet government began forcing peasants to surrender their land, their livestock, and their tools to collective farms controlled by the state. Those who resisted, labeled kulaks, meaning wealthy peasants, though the term was applied with brutal flexibility, were deported, imprisoned, or shot. Between 1930 and 1932, approximately 1.8 million people were deported to labor camps in Siberia and Central Asia. Many did not survive the journey. By 1932, the collective farm system had been established across the Soviet Union, and the state had assumed near total control over the harvest. The harvest of 1932 was, by any objective measure, difficult. Drought affected some regions. The disruption caused by forced collectivization had reduced the number of experienced farmers working the land. Livestock had been slaughtered by peasants who refused to hand their animals over to the collectives. By some estimates, the Soviet Union lost nearly half its cattle and horses between 1929 and 1933. And yet the grain procurement quotas, the amounts the state demanded from each region, were not reduced. In some areas, they were increased. Here is where the story begins to fracture. Official Soviet reports from late 1932 acknowledged in internal communications that certain regions were experiencing difficulties. Procurement targets were being missed. But in the public sphere, the language remained triumphant, and the harvest was celebrated. The system was working. There was no famine, and crucially, there was no acknowledgement that one was coming. What followed was one of the most catastrophic demographic events of the 20th century. Between 1932 and 1933, somewhere between 5 and 7 million people died of starvation across the Soviet Union. The majority perished in Ukraine, where the famine is known today as the Holodomor, a Ukrainian word that translates with terrible precision as death inflicted by starvation. Kazakhstan lost a staggering proportion of its nomadic population. Some historians estimate that between 1.5 and 2 million Kazakhs died, representing nearly 40% of the entire ethnic Kazakh population. These were not deaths at the margins. This was a civilization being erased by hunger, region by region, village by village. What makes the archival record so unsettling is not simply what it contains, but what was deliberately removed from it. The Soviet census of 1937 was suppressed. When demographers reported results that revealed a dramatic and inexplicable population decline, Stalin ordered the data buried. The statisticians who compiled the census were arrested. Several were executed. A new census was conducted in 1939, and its figures were adjusted to reflect the population the government preferred to show the world. But fragments survived. Internal OGPU reports, documents from the Soviet secret police, describe conditions in Ukrainian villages in the winter of 1932 with clinical detachment. One report from December 1932 describes mass swelling from hunger in the Kharkiv region. Another, from January 1933, notes that corpses were being left in the streets because there were not enough healthy people remaining to bury the dead. These documents were not intended for public consumption. They were written by state officials, for state officials, in the language of administration, and they describe a catastrophe. At the same time, in the same months, Soviet grain was being exported. In 1932, the Soviet Union exported approximately 1.73 million tons of grain to foreign markets. The revenue was needed to fund industrialization. The optics of famine were, for Stalin, politically unacceptable, a sign of weakness, a contradiction of the narrative of socialist success, so the borders were sealed. In January 1933, an internal Soviet decree restricted the movement of peasants out of Ukraine and the North Caucasus. People who tried to flee to cities in search of food were turned back. The famine was contained, not by ending it, but by preventing anyone from escaping it. When historians began accessing Soviet archives after the collapse of the USSR in 1991, certain patterns emerged that were difficult to explain through the lens of accident or mismanagement alone. The regions most severely affected by the famine were also, not coincidentally, the regions with the strongest traditions of cultural and national identity that the Soviet state had reasons to suppress. Ukraine had a long history of resistance to Russian imperial authority. Kazakhstan's nomadic culture was, by its nature, incompatible with collectivization. The North Caucasus contained ethnic populations with their own languages, their own histories, their own relationships to the land. The famine, some historians argue, did not simply happen to these regions. It was, in some meaningful sense, directed at them. The evidence for this is not a single document with a smoking gun. History rarely works that way. Instead, it is assembled from a pattern of decisions: the maintenance of export quotas during the height of starvation, the restriction of internal movement, the blacklisting of specific villages deemed to have failed their procurement targets, the denial of seed grain needed for future planting, the removal of all food from households during search operations in the winter of 1932 to 1933. In November 1932, a decree was issued placing certain Ukrainian and North Caucasian villages on a blacklist. Villages on this list were denied access to goods from state stores: no sugar, no matches, no kerosene, no manufactured goods of any kind. The intent, as stated in internal correspondence, was to compel greater grain delivery. In practice, it accelerated starvation. The official record tells one story. The human record tells another. Mykola Kostyrko was a school teacher in the Poltava region of Ukraine. In a diary recovered decades later, he wrote in the spring of 1933 that he had counted 17 bodies on the road between two villages in a single morning's walk. He noted that the children in his school were too weak to hold their pencils. He wrote that he had nothing left to give them. His diary ends abruptly in April 1933. Anastasia Lysenko, interviewed by Ukrainian researchers in the 1990s when she was in her 80s, recalled watching her mother attempt to make soup from tree bark and dried leaves. She recalled the sound of her younger brother crying in the night, and then one morning, not crying anymore. She recalled the silence of her village, a silence she said she had never heard before and never forgot. There were no dogs left, she told the interviewer, no cats, no birds near the houses. Everything had been eaten. A Welsh journalist named Gareth Jones visited Soviet Ukraine in March 1933 and reported what he saw with unflinching clarity. He walked through villages. He spoke to survivors. He wrote that he had seen famine, real famine, the kind that hollows out a face and bends a body into a shape it was never meant to take. His reports were published in Western newspapers. They were immediately and aggressively dismissed by Walter Duranty, the Moscow correspondent for the New York Times, who had cultivated close access to Soviet officials and who insisted, in print, that there was no famine. Duranty won a Pulitzer Prize in 1932. Jones died under mysterious circumstances in 1935 at the age of 29, while on a journey through Mongolian territory. The contrast between these two men, one who went and looked and one who stayed and denied, is a quiet, persistent question that history has not finished asking. Here is what we know with reasonable certainty. Between 1932 and 1933, millions of people died of starvation in the Soviet Union. The Soviet state was aware of this. Internal documents confirm it. The state continued grain exports during the height of the famine. The state restricted the movement of starving people. The state suppressed demographic data that would have revealed the scale of mortality. For decades, the Soviet government denied that a famine had occurred at all. Here is what remains genuinely contested. Was the famine the result of catastrophically bad policy, implemented with reckless disregard for human life? Or was it something more deliberate, a tool of political and ethnic suppression, consciously directed against specific populations? In 2006, the Ukrainian parliament formally recognized the Holodomor as an act of genocide. Approximately 30 other countries have followed. Russia, to this day, does not. The distinction matters enormously, legally and morally, but the dead, in either interpretation, remain dead in the same numbers. What the archives have revealed, slowly and incompletely, is a bureaucratic apparatus that processed human suffering with extraordinary administrative thoroughness. Reports were filed. Quotas were tracked. Procurement figures were recorded down to the last kilogram. Somewhere in those numbers, in those precise, careful columns of grain and tonnage and regional targets, is the shape of a decision. Whether that decision was made consciously, as policy, or whether it emerged from the collision of ideology and incompetence, is the question that serious historians continue to debate. But there is another question, quieter and perhaps more troubling. If the Soviet census of 1937 had not been suppressed, if the journalists who reported the truth had been believed, if the internal OGPU documents had been made public in 1933 rather than discovered in 1991, would the world have responded differently? And if so, to what extent does the silence of that era belong not only to the Soviet state, but to all of those who chose, for reasons of ideology or convenience or simple discomfort, to look away? The files exist. They sit now in archives in Kyiv and Moscow and Washington, declassified, catalogued, available to any researcher willing to read them. The evidence of what happened in 1932 and 1933 is not hidden anymore. It has been assembled, piece by piece, from the fragments that survived, the diaries, the secret police reports, the suppressed census data, the testimony of the very old who remembered what the world had been told to forget, and still the full shape of it resists easy understanding. Perhaps that is because the scale is genuinely incomprehensible. 5 million, 6 million, 7 million people in a span of months, in a country that the rest of the world was watching, at least partially, from a distance. Perhaps it is because the machinery that produced this outcome was so ordinary in its components. Bureaucratic forms, procurement quotas, border restrictions, newspaper headlines, that it refuses to look like what it was. Or perhaps it is because the story asks something of us that is uncomfortable to answer. It asks how a government can announce a record harvest while its people are dying in the fields where that harvest was grown. It asks how the world can be told that everything is fine and choose to believe it. It asks what it means to know something is happening and to find, in the architecture of ideology or convenience or distance, a reason not to act. Somewhere in the Poltava region, there is a road that a schoolteacher walked in the spring of 1933. He counted the dead and he wrote it down, and the diary ended and the silence came. The grain continued to move west, toward the ports, toward the ships, toward the foreign currency that would build the factories of the future. Maybe there was nothing that could have been done differently. Maybe the forces of history and ideology were simply too large, too entrenched, too fast. Or maybe the most important thing the archives tell us is not what was hidden from the world, but what the world was offered. A clear view, a warning, a name for what was happening and what was done, so often with that clarity. The files are open now. The question is whether we are finally willing to read them.